He wouldn't stop until metal obeyed his idea of perfection. In a narrow Vienna workshop, late at night, a young Ferdinand Porsche bent over a glowing piece of steel as if listening for the answer inside it. Sparks landed like punctuation on blueprints pinned to the wall. The smell of oil and hot brass filled the air. He had already sketched electric motors decades ahead of anyone else, machines that hummed with a future the world was not yet ready to buy. Yet what haunted him was more personal. The image of a two-seat sports car that matched the precision of his mind, a car he could not yet afford, but which he could, at least, design until it felt inevitable. Those designs would become a legend, but the path was not romanticized. There were arrests and interrogations, factories commandeered by political winds, and a family name dragged through public suspicion. The war bent iron and men alike. The company teetered on bankruptcy in the aftermath. You can almost hear the creak of the office chair where Ferry Porsche sat, hands stained with grease and ledgers, negotiating with banks by day and refusing compromises by night. When his father was detained, when creditors circled, Ferry did the work many great founders never do. He steadied the business, cleared the family's reputation, and quietly translated obsession into production. The first cars came out like answers to a long, private question. The Porsche 356 was shaped by an uncompromising standard lightness, balance, and instinct for proportion lines that would, over the next decade, resolve into the unmistakable silhouette of the 911. The genius was not just in an engine or a curve, but in an insistence that every decision be measured against a clear ideal. That insistence delivered extraordinary cars, but it also cost relationships, peace of mind, and nearly the company itself. This is a story for anyone who wrestles with the same demons. To push until something is right, or to let the work leave the garage and meet the world. If your perfectionism is keeping you from launching, tell me below. What's your biggest pain? I read every reply. In the next segment, we'll follow Ferry into the financial abyss and watch how he turned ruthless exactness into the decisive execution that saved the mark. The workshop smelled of burnt oil and cold iron. Under gaslights, Ferdinand Porsche bent over drawings that looked more like music than machinery. Spirals of copper, coils nested with surgical precision, notes in the margin about torque that no one yet measured. He had been a boy who could hear the rhythm of currents and a man who learned to make metal answer rhythm with obedience. Early patents for electric motors and transmission ideas read like a prophecy, technologies ahead of their market, ahead of their time. But brilliance lived beside a private compulsion. He wanted a sports car he could not or would not buy, so he would build it instead. That compulsion turned every prototype into a battlefield. Make it obey, he would say, not as a threat but as a creed, and mechanics moved like a religious order around him. Nights stretched long. Test runs left tracks of grease on the floors and on the faces of men who had to match a feverish standard. The first shapes that would become Porsche aesthetics were hammered in low-lit coachworks, bodies flared, engines tucked like heartbeats. Each success carried a shadow. Compromises refused, partnerships strained, and eventually, politics and war intruded, turning workshop debates into questions of survival. Arrests and political suspicion hollowed out the name, leaving Ferry, his son, with a charred ledger and a reputation to stitch back together. Ferry's leadership was less about genius than about relentless execution. He learned to translate his father's exacting language into an assembly line the company could afford. The Porsche 356 arose not from a single epiphany but from 1,000 small decisions. Which supplier to trust, which coach builder to keep, how light could be honest and not fragile. On the racetracks, the car learned its place. On the roads, it taught a generation what performance could feel like alongside reliability. It was the alchemy of obsession made usable. Standards kept, deadlines met, debts paid. If any of this lands on a nerve, if you recognize the friend or enemy in your own perfectionism, give this video a nod with a like and tell me in the comments. What's the one thing your standards have stopped you from launching? Stay with me. Next, we break down the exact choices Ferry made to turn peril into a living legend and how those choices still shape every Porsche you see today. The workshop smelled of oil and burnt varnish, a narrow room where light fell in razor strips across half-finished bodies. Ferry stood with his hands at his sides, watching a welder coax a seam into silence. Around him men whispered about parts that would not arrive, about creditors at the door, about a name still blackened by the headlines of a war none of them wanted to relive. He could have let the legend sleep. Instead he leaned into the mechanics of rescue the same way his father had leaned into the mechanics of a curve, relentlessly and without ornament. "You can't keep redesigning," his chief engineer said, wiping his palms on a rag. "We need cars out the door or we fold." Ferry's reply was not a rebuttal but a decision. "Then we design to what can be built," he said, hearing his father's standards in every syllable. "Not to what we imagine in idle hours." It was a small surrender and a large liberation. Where obsession had previously stretched toward impossible refinements, Ferry now translated exacting taste into tolerances, into repeatable jigs, into a production rhythm that could be taught and copied. The first 356 rolled from the lift like a patient finally answering a long plea. Metal settled into place. Leather stretched like a promise. An engine coughed and then sang. When Ferry took the wheel for the first time, the road cut toward the mountains and the car responded with that improbable combination of precision and soul, the feeling that a machine had been given permission to be itself. In that drive he recognized the paradox, perfection as paralysis versus perfection as discipline. The latter required letting some ideals wait while others were executed flawlessly. Yet the triumph was not free. Names had to be cleared, contracts renegotiated, craftsmen paid in trust more than cash. Every bolt tightened was a quiet negotiation with fate. The 356 was not just a car. It was proof that an idea could be turned into hundreds of working pieces, and that obsession, tamed by decision, became a method for building legacy. If that struggle sounds familiar, if your own standards are battlegrounds that stop you from shipping, tell me in the comments. What's your biggest pain? I read every reply. Stay with this story. What comes next is the cost of success and the moral bill that the Porsches would have to pay, and the choices that turned a single model into an icon. The factory floor fades to a narrow pool of light where an elderly man studies a curved fender like a priest before a relic. The room smells of oil and heat, the clack of a radio, the distant rumble of a test engine. Ferdinand's notebooks lie open, sketches of electric motors, schematics annotated in an iron hand. Beside him, Ferry wipes grease from his brow and says softly, "We will make it right." It is not boasting. It is a promise forged in salvage yards and courtrooms, in nights when the lights stayed on because someone refused to let the name die. The story we have followed is not a neat triumph. It is a tightrope walk between brilliance and ruin. In one frame you see the 356 slide cleanly through a corner, its balance whispered into existence by countless small corrections. In the next, a ledger flashes across the screen stained with debt, a man in a suit counting the cost. Perfection demands sacrifice, of time, of relationships, of moral clarity. Porsche's obsession delivered a timeless machine, yes, but it also left a trail of worn hands and choices that haunt the brand's history. That tension, creation versus consequence, is the lesson that lingers after the engine dies and the applause subsides. Obsession, when anchored to a clear purpose and steady leadership, becomes the engine of execution. Left untethered, it can be a prison that turns ability into paralysis. Ferry's achievement was not simply in polishing a design. It was in translating fanatic standards into a process that others could follow. Tolerances, test procedures, and insistence on doing things right until right was repeatable. That is where genius meets endurance. If you leave this film with one clear thing, let it be this: perfection is useful only when it produces something the world can use. So tell me, is perfection stopping you from launching? Drop a comment below. I read every reply. If you want more stories that strip legend down to the human cost and the hard lessons, subscribe and join the next ride into the histories that shaped our roads.